Hello everyone. This video is about Pascal's wager. In this video, we're going to begin by considering the central argument in Pascal's wager. This is one of the readings for this week. This is from pages 364 to 368 from the book. I'll also post a PDF of the reading on the course Canvas page, and in addition, it's immediately above the video. So if you use a screen reader, it should be able to pick that up. Okay, so this is the argument in the reading for this week. It's known as Pascal's wager. So the first premise is that if there is a God, he's infinitely incomprehensible, and so reason can decide nothing here. So this is what's happening at the beginning of the reading. What Pascal is doing is arguing that we can't know anything about God because he's infinitely incomprehensible, right? So reason can't help us figure out whether or not he exists at all. And this is sort of the premise that sets up his wager in why it's important and necessary, because we can't know whether or not God exists. Now, the second premise of the argument is that you must wager. It's not optional. So what this means is that you have to choose whether or not God exists. You can't sort of be in between the two of them, right? So either you have to believe, yes, God exists, or no, God doesn't exist. Okay? The third premise is that if you gain all, and if you lose nothing. This is right at the center of what we're going to cover today. So this is why Pascal's argument works. And so because of this, right, then we should wager without hesitation that he is, which means that we should always choose to believe that God exists. So now I'm going to go into the what's behind premise number 3, which is right at the center of this argument. So what is the wager in Pascal's wager? Well, the idea is to choose whether or not you believe that God exists, right? So that's the wager, to choose whether to believe that God exists or not. And there are two choices, of course. You can either believe that God exists, right, or you can believe that God doesn't exist. Now, what happens when we choose to believe that God does exist? There are two possible outcomes. The first is that we're right. So we believe that God exists, and it turns out that God does exist. So what do we get in this circumstance? Well, when we believe that God exists and we're right and God exists, we get eternal life in heaven. So that's really good. So what about in the second outcome? What do we get when we believe that God does exist and we're wrong? So we believe that God exists, right? But it turns out that we're wrong and God doesn't exist. What do we get in this circumstance? Well, nothing, right? We just die. So we believe that God exists and God doesn't exist, and nothing happens. We just die. Okay. Now, what happens when we choose the other side of the wager? We choose that God doesn't exist. Again, here, there's two possible outcomes, right? So we're right. So we believe that God doesn't exist, and it turns out we're right, and he doesn't exist. What do we get? Nothing. We just die. Okay? But what do we get when we believe that God doesn't exist and we're wrong? So we believe that he doesn't exist, and it turns out that he does. Well, in this case, it's not great, right? We get eternal damnation. So let's weigh the outcomes of these two choices. The best outcome when we believe that God doesn't exist is nothing. We just die. So that's the best possible thing that can come from believing that God doesn't exist, right? But the best outcome when we believe that God does exist is eternal life in heaven. So that's pretty great, right? But notice that the worst outcome that happens when we believe that God does exist is nothing. We just die. So, it's not great to die, but that doesn't really matter all that much. However, notice that the worst outcome when we believe that God doesn't exist is eternal damnation. So that's not great. So to sort of summarize what's going on here, right, and to look at Pascal's conclusion, the only rational thing to do when we can't be sure whether or not that God exists is to believe that God does exist. This is because in the worst case, if we're wrong, we're just going to die. However, in the best case, when we're right, we get eternal life in heaven. The alternative, however, the best we get is that we just die. However, the worst that we get is eternal damnation. So now I'm going to go over the argument one last time, just to make sure that it's clear. So this is sort of the argument of Pascal's wager, right? If there is a God, he's infinitely incomprehensible, so reason can decide nothing. Okay, so according to Pascal, we can't know whether or not God exists. So because of this, reason can't help us figure out whether or not he exists. However, we have to choose, right, whether or not we believe that God exists. So we must wager. It's not optional. And as I just showed, under these conditions, we get premise 3. The only rational thing to do is to believe that God exists, because in this case, if you gain all, but if you lose nothing. So we get Pascal's conclusion that we should wager then, without hesitation, that God exists.